become quite clear that Max Verstappen can only be defeated by a driver who has no fear, and I reckon that McLaren has two drivers that could fit the bill. But it's the other one that I'm more interested with, so if you're a Lando Norris fan, hear me out about this one, okay? I must preface this video by saying that yes, Oscar Piastri is my favourite driver at the moment, and McLaren is my favourite team. So instead of me just going off on one and going, oh my god, Oscar's so great, I actually asked you all on Twitter what you think about Oscar, what you liked about him and what you didn't like about him. And I encourage you to do the same as well in the comments below, so do type out why you like and don't like Oscar. But from the Twitter submissions, there is generally a very positive view of Oscar. They love his calm and cool-headed demeanour, as do I, and they find his understated sense of humour rather charming. Many appreciate that he stays focused and doesn't really complain all that much, drawing favourable comparisons to drivers like Scott Dixon, Alex Palou, and many people saying Kimi Räikkönen. That's quite an on-the-nose comparison about Oscar, comparing him to Alex Palou, what with the ongoing litigation between he and Zach Brown. Overall, my community sees him as mature, humble, and capable of making bold moves when needed. However, one comment that kept on coming up was the fact that his tyre management and race pace aren't there yet. That will come with practice, and McLaren are happy with his progress, but it is still a limiting factor in his overall driving ability. And then some people said that he comes across as too polished or too nice, and I will give you that. Oscar does come across sometimes as a chap who's been trained really well in terms of not giving away anything to the media. But when you stop and think about who his manager is, Mark and Anne Webber, then it all makes sense, given what he had to go through during the times of Red Bull when it looked odds on that he could have been going for the World Championship and he was going toe-to-toe with Sebastian Vettel in terms of team orders. Mark went through a lot of things, so I'm pretty sure that he doesn't want any of his drivers that he manages to go through the same thing. I personally can't think of a better person to have your back, especially in case there's team orders involved. He could be just right behind Zach Brown's ear on the pit wall and be just going, Multi-21, Zach. Multi-21. As a result, all of this preparation might have stunted him initially in establishing himself in the midst of another court case with the Contract Recognition Board, which was so damning for Alpine that they had to completely gut their legal team and start over. But at the same time, these kinds of shenanigans resulted in Oscar Piastri not getting out of this scot-free or squeaky clean. For a long time, I saw many people thinking of Oscar and Mark Webber as villains, cruel, ruthless, completely screwing over Alpine, and instead thinking about their own selfish desires, and not to mention being the people responsible for almost kicking Daniel Ricciardo out of Formula 1 entirely. There are a lot of Ricciardo fans who are angry and ditching their papaya suits and merchandise in favour of Red Bull stuff when they took him in, pulling a Perez from 2020. Being associated with his dismissal will not start you off with a good impression, which is why I even reckoned he was a bit like a robot for the first few races. But that quickly dissipated once we reached Austria at the cost of a jetman's dignity. Now I know that you're going to be bringing up again the whole thing about time management, and yes, you are fair to point out that. But when you consider that his own teammate has been quite vocal about the situation with Pirelli rubber, which he reckoned played a part in the chaos that was the Melbourne restart last year, him viewing the overall compounds as terrible, and that it shouldn't be used in F1, stating that the drivers need more grip for a sport such as F1. This is not the first time that Pirelli's been in trouble with either a driver or a team or the safety department of Formula 1, for they either make a tyre that is not exciting enough, it's too exciting, it's too dangerous, it's too cautious. They just can't get it right, can they? And that's all the more telling when they are considering bringing in yet another new type of compound. We do have a C0, which has not made an appearance whatsoever after being introduced. They are now thinking about bringing in a C6 tyre for tracks like Monaco or Canada. So basically, they're bringing the Hypersofts back. The comments from Norris allowed Piastri some wiggle room in that Pirelli F1 tyres are quite a tricky beast to manage, and the compound is changing almost every year, what with the tyre test being conducted almost every single Grand Prix. And if I'm right in thinking, Oscar hasn't done a test for Pirelli yet, which is a curious thought. So if you're getting drivers who are experienced as Norris having problems with the tyre and then indeed getting frustrated in that it just simply does not have enough grip when you need it, so you need to warm them up carefully, having that experience and that ability to manage the tyres is not something that comes easily to a brand new driver. This will be something that he figures out with experience, and it's a lot better than it used to be, because I remember the Hungarian Grand Prix when he was really aggressive with his tyres last year, and he was odds on for a podium, but then he fell down to 5th, 6th place. He was just tumbling down the order. and it didn't really help that he had damage as well, which is why when we've had situations where tyre wear was not a thing, such as in the sprint races or in the Qatar Grand Prix last year where there was a mandated 3-stop strategy put in place for all drivers, we saw Oscar shine, and he was free to go after Max Verstappen and immediately impress, with the Dutchman saying that it was particularly interesting and exciting to get a chance of racing fresh blood. It's those little comments that really get me excited for when Piastri's fully completed his transition into Formula 1, when he gets a chance to race Max Verstappen in anger during a whole Grand Prix instead of just a sprint. But ultimately Max did get past him, and Oscar didn't really see much point in trying to keep him behind, because otherwise he might have fallen behind to second, third, fourth after really impressing in that sprint weekend. It's just a shame that the race didn't work out ultimately, and then that sparked just one of the most bizarre and random rivalries and spats that I've seen in the sport. Carlos and Oscar? Oh, okay, I did not expect that to have formed, and then manifest itself with on-track battles and a really awkward cooldown room, making it the worst podcast episode in recent memory. However, it's the start of last year's British race which wowed me more about what Oscar could do in the future. You remember how Lando copped past Max for a few laps, right? Well, at the same time, at the start, Oscar just went in on the inside to try and hoodwink them both, now that he had a car in which to do something like that effectively, and he didn't crash. It probably gave Max and Lando a bit of a surprise and really established him in the mind of Verstappen, saying in one particular interview that if he had the chance to manage his own team and he couldn't be one of the drivers racing that car, he would pick both McLaren drivers, him rating Norris very highly, him mentioning especially that Oscar was a really smart guy. And funny you should mention smart guys, Max, because this could turn out into being one of the most effective rivals going up against your driving style. And all of this starting to make up for his really tricky starts in Suzuka in Spain, where he was just simply lacking the pace, which Verstappen also points out as an issue that the Australian needs to work on. And then when I look back to an interview Oscar did with Speed Cafe, the prospect of a Piastri-Verstappen dogfight in a full-length Grand Prix is tantalising, even more so than Norris and Verstappen. Given what happened during the Austrian Grand Prix and what we could expect going forward, but maybe at a slightly lower volume, you only then have to look at the idols of both drivers to tell you where exactly this is going to go. Both men will not back down, and it's simply down to the fact that both men idolise the likes of Ayrton Senna, with Lando Norris also liking the MotoGP star Valentino Rossi, him being the inspiration for his fluorescent yellow colour scheme, as well as the numbering. And when Norris got to hang out with Rossi, many people dubbed him the nurse to Rossi's the doctor. It's okay for both men to like Senna and find inspiration from his driving style in it being aggressive, tenacious, and relentless. But when you get two Sennas confronting each other at the front for the lead, it's only going to go one way, and you're also going to get the kind of conduct that you got from Verstappen after the collision. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, him trying to run Lando off of the grass, and at the same time Lando thinking he could actually get through to the right instead of going to the left, both men were in a hurry, and yeah, it's just not gonna work out in the sense of getting to the end, unless you just completely ruin each other's tyres. Sure, using brute force might get you past Max Verstappen, but in some circumstances, and especially when he cottons onto that fact, you are going to need to find a different way in which to get past the Dutchman. You might need the skills of a professor. I understand. Alain Prost isn't the most likeable man in F1. The Senna documentary of yesteryear didn't help matters. But these two men were hard racers, and Senna's death probably hurt Prost the most, given that once Prost had retired, the two managed to reconcile, and the Frenchman holds those last months close to his heart once racing and politics were out of the equation between them. The point is, though, is that Oscar holds Alain Prost in high regard, and is aiming to try and emulate the driver in his overall approach to racing, as well as making sure that his setup is as optimal as it can be. You know, to not necessarily hustle the car and overdrive it to the point where you're going to completely ruin any chance of a finish right at the end, but instead, Oscar intends to come up with a setup that works for him and slowly pick things up off the order. Even though he did get nobbled with a track limits violation which sent him from 3rd to 7th, Oscar did the best he could in which to recover to a very respectable 4th place, which then became a 2nd place after you-know-what happened at the front. In many cases, Ayrton would sprint off the line and Prost would hang back in lower positions, only to come back sometimes toward the end of the race and be ready for a scrap with Senna or breeze past him if the tyres or car were fading for the Brazilian. And even though there are some similarities between the driving styles of Norris and Piastri, there are some key differences which the website F1 Tempo illustrates for me very clearly. When you compare Lando and Oscar Oscar's fastest laps, Lando was 6/10 faster on his fastest on fresh rubber and catching Max after his botched stop, and with DRS helping from passing traffic, Piastri is a lot more steady on the pedals instead of the on or off mentality of Norris, and yet the reverse is apparent when it comes to gear changes, meaning potentially engine braking is Piastri's friend in slowing down the car, as well as the brake and turn-in, which is a lot smoother than Lando's wheel input. Perhaps this slight subtle difference in driving style might yield to Piastri doing better once he can get over the tyre management issues, and him idolising the likes of Alain Prost is similar to what went on when Button and Hamilton were teammates. Button doing a lot better against Hamilton than many people expected. Whilst it might be more exciting to see Norris handling and perhaps beating Verstappen, what all of this shows is that it will only encourage Max to be even more aggressive, since this is a genuine challenge to his title now that McLaren are right up there with Red Bull. And what this is going to illustrate to every single driver up and down the grid is that sometimes you don't need to go after Norris and Verstappen. If they are going to be the two main drivers contesting the World Championship this year, probably a dress rehearsal for 2025, and McLaren will probably be even closer to Red Bull, maybe even sometimes besting them consistently, then maybe it might not be worth getting involved in that battle. And instead, you just got to do enough to just hang back, watch what happens, and then make the most of it, which is exactly what Oscar Piastri did during the sprint, him then ending up in second place, and then what George Russell did in him getting the win there. Piastri mentioning that he had readied the popcorn, which inevitably came good, him capitalising on Norris going deep and ultimately finishing behind Piastri with not enough time for Norris to get back past and go after Max, who dashed off afterward, and then that led to criticism from British pundits that Oscar Piastri had effectively denied Lando Norris the opportunity to correct himself, get past his Australian teammate, and then try and get Max Verstappen again, which I find personally extremely egregious. Lando made a mistake. He even admitted so. It was an amateurish move, said the Brit, and that Oscar was just there, ready to pounce, and just show again that he's there when McLaren needs him. And look, I understand that we didn't get an exciting finale with Oscar going after Max. Ultimately, Max was able to get 4-ish seconds ahead of Oscar. Oscar probably knew that he wasn't going to catch up to Max, so what would be the point of damaging his tyres and then potentially falling back behind Lando and maybe into the clutches of the Mercedes and Ferrari drivers? And when it comes to McLaren enacting team orders to get Norris back ahead of Piastri, Andrea Stella says that right now, it's too early to do such things. It's not the right time to call such manoeuvres. And McLaren, are they really going to be pulling team orders after all of the stuff that's gone throughout their history, which includes Senna and Prost? Most likely, they will assess the situation, as they've said, race by race, and will then determine whether or not a driver should hold position. It's a case-by-case basis instead of just a season-long consensus. It made me think, yes, Oscar's approach to racing at the front may not be exciting or particularly showy, but when it comes to points and places in the championship, sometimes being flashy doesn't matter. By using that approach, Oscar got results. He knew his limits and what he could accomplish at that time. He got second place in the sprint, he got second place in the race. Sure, he might have had the rubber to go after George Russell because when you compare the Mercedes and the McLaren is still faster than the Mercedes, even though Mercedes are improving their car race by race and George Russell is regaining his confidence. Oscar probably knew his limits and instead just did the best he could to keep second place. He got past Sainz. Sainz could have easily gotten him back. Given the situation with Sainz and their historic spats, it probably would have been wiser to conserve the tyres in case Sainz did a last-minute charge. This is all a fact-finding mission, not just for Norris and Verstappen, but also for Piastri. He has to understand what he can do, what he can offer the team, and be ready in case Norris and Verstappen take each other out or have a situation again. And McLaren are discovering what it's like to go for titles in this era of F1 as well, having not been close to this vantage point for over a decade. One thing that we saw during the Austrian Grand Prix is that McLaren is not afraid to get passionate and overly supportive of their drivers. They not only had Norris's back throughout the entire situation with Verstappen, but they also had the back of Oscar Piastri when he lost that third place position due to track limits. They were supporting both drivers, so there is no sense of favouritism at the moment, because if there had been, they probably would have just taken the track limits thing on the chin, not protested it because they knew the odds were stacked against them, because usually with track limits it's a slam dunk, especially since there was a gravel trap, sausage curbs, AI, lots of things against them, but they tried anyway. But I still think they probably went a little bit too far in sharing Anthony Davidson's analysis from one point of view. that overstepped the mark a little bit. And while seeing Norris getting to fight Verstappen is exciting and will bring more attention to F1 again, which can only be a good thing because there has been bleeding audience figures for the last couple of years, I'm more jazzed to see Piastri having a crack at it when he's good and ready. To me, what made the Senna-Prost situation all the more tantalizing and fascinating was the fact that those two men were complete opposites of one another. One drove flat out, the other drove more methodically. And that was cemented immediately when Ayrton Senna introduced himself to the world at the Monaco Grand Prix of 1984. Alain Prost was leading that Grand Prix, and Ayrton Senna was rapidly catching him up in second place. So, Prost saw a threat, and he saw that the conditions were not going to get any better because the rain was really bad. He then just waved his hands, called for the race to be stopped, and indeed it was stopped. Now, I'm not saying this was fair. This was not the right thing to do, because it just established that there was a clear French bias with F1, the FIA, Balestre being the president of the FIA, Alain Prost, a French driver, going for the World Championship that year. Of course he's going to support a French driver. And this, of course, denied Ayrton Senna overtaking him. And okay, let's be fair to Alain a little bit. It was dangerous. This is the 1980s. It could easily lead to a very big accident if Senna was not willing to back down, which is why I can't wait for Oscar to get his tyre management in order, which McLaren's boss reckons is improving and will come. Piastri attributing his struggles down to a lot of 2023 circuits being completely new to him, and is more willing to put his hand up when he's just downright slow. And he also mentions that the F1 car at the moment, it's a really tricky car in which to try and get a handle of, the McLaren car especially. Because I remember a comment that Carlos Sainz made to Daniel when he joined the team, when he went, "Tricky car, eh?" Because Carlos Sainz knew how tricky that McLaren car was inherently, and it's only now that the eccentricities and the weakness with low-speed corners with that McLaren are suddenly being addressed and corrected. Both men, Lando included, will now have a car which is more complete and more able to come to any track and be good at. Once he has the tyres down pat, Oscar could be the driver to effectively best Verstappen without resorting to overly aggressive racing, to which he was doing with Norris. The consensus was that Piastri was unflappable, unfazed, relentless, fearless, and that's the kind of mentality you need against Max, because Max and Lando proved neither are going to be backing down. The only way you are going to pressure Max Verstappen right now into conceding is either pushing him into a mistake of his own volition, or it pushes him to the point where the tyres give out on him. And when it comes to the hard tyres, the RB20 isn't all that great on them. Better yet, if Oscar can use his improving qualifying abilities to either be close to Norris or be on pole, he could pressure Max in a different way, keeping him behind him, hustling him to the nth degree, and then making a mistake that way. Now, I've voiced this next point before, and I know it's a bit of speculation, it's conjecture, it's a what if. But in one reality out there, somewhere, we might see Oscar Piastri already on 3 Grand Prix victories. Yes, of course, the Monaco Grand Prix. It's effectively impossible to try and get past, and Leclerc was just delaying everybody, leading to the point where F1 cars were slower than F2 cars. That's just mad. And it's also become clear that McLaren's getting sick and tired of the FIA, because it was an FIA penalty at Imola which denied Oscar Piastri starting on pole potentially, knocking him down, but then again, that was down to a lack of communication on the team's part, so they really should be cross at themselves. Now, before you say anything, this is not me downing on Lando at all. No. Norris is a more experienced driver and is rightly showing Verstappen he is not going to back down, which is a valid and laudable tactic in trying to topple the Dutchman's stranglehold on the championship. However, it's not the only way of trying to best Verstappen. It might not be the most efficient way either, since Verstappen will not back down as he gains more experience figuring out Norris. It's become clear that Norris's method of trying to get past Verstappen until the McLaren car is convincingly ahead of the Red Bull car is to just do whatever you can to get past Verstappen, make sure he cannot scamper off, and then dictate the race pace from there, because it became apparent that as the Mercedes car got behind another car, if it was not dominating, it would have problems with cooling. If Oscar were in his shoes and had the boots and insight as Norris, he would probably hang back more and be ready for the moment Max tripped up if it came or his tyres went off. Like I mentioned, Oscar probably knows his limits, so instead of going after Verstappen once he got past Norris in the sprint, he held back, tried a little bit, but then realised that the jig was up, so it's best to keep second place instead of trying to go for first and then falling back spectacularly. If you're a Norris fan, you might be thinking I'm wanting Lando to fail. No, I'm not. I want Lando to prove himself and give Max a spook himself. However, I also want Oscar to have a go and see how he would handle it. And that will probably come next year. I still stand by my original video from last year that Oscar Piastri could be one of those drivers that could end the domination of Max Verstappen. But now, given the extra context and the insight from Piastri himself, it could be simply down to the fact that Piastri's a different driver to Max Verstappen, a more logical driver, a more methodical one, wanting to try and best Max Verstappen by simply outsmarting the guy. That's what you gotta do. To beat Max, you have to outwit him, you have to swindle him, hoodwink him, whilst also being quick as well when you need to be. That might come to Lando as well when he realises that brute strength might not be enough to get past Max. You need to try something else. So maybe both McLaren drivers might seek inspiration from the other. And then you will truly have a team that can easily go and win the Constructors this year. Because right now, Sergio Perez, he's about to be overtaken by Piastri and Russell. And if Hamilton kicks on and starts getting podiums and wins, Perez might be 8th in the championship. 8th! But either way, with Norris and Piastri, I'm here for it. Much like how I'm here for Logan Sargent putting an end to the naysayers and choose his own adventure in IndyCar with a brand new promo operation there, if the rumours are to be believed. Something of which I discuss in this video here that you can go and watch right now. It's probably a realistic opportunity, and I'm here for that. Oh yes!